It's been interesting to be on sabbatical. Since I started pastoring a church in 1980, I've never been 9 weeks out of the pulpit. First time ever. And some people may have the idea that sabbatical is vacation. It was not. I was very active during my sabbatical, but I was doing different things. And the pace was much different than when you're working pastoring a church. I feel much more rested and restored. A couple of people have actually commented about that today. I did not accomplish all my goals. Some of you might remember that I told you one of my goals was to read the entire Bible through in 8 weeks. I thought, I can do this. First weekend, I said, no way. I get bogged down in details. Somebody went to Padan Aram. I'm the kind of guy that has to pull a map out and find out where Padan Aram is. I get caught up in the details. And so I decided, rather than try to read lots of the Bible quickly, I would do my natural inclination, which is to study it in more depth. And so while I did not get the breadth of the reading done, the depth of my study has been a real blessing to me. I decided that instead of reading the RSV, which has kind of always been my go-to Bible since that's what I used in seminary and in undergrad school, instead of using that or the King James or even the contemporary English version, they all have a certain cadence and a certain similarity. I decided I was going to read something that was very, very different, the New Living Translation. And the reason I decided to do something so very different was because I'm not studying for doctrine. I'm just trying to get new ideas. And I found out that when I'm reading a Bible translation that I know really well, that's familiar, I found out that I tend to skip a little bit. I already know what it says here, and so I kind of speed read it. It's just my normal. I tend to try to read fast anyway. And so when I'm reading something, I kind of already know how it puts it anyway. I found that I kind of just speed read through it and I don't really in depth. So I decided to read a Bible translation that was so totally different that it would be totally fresh look. And so I chose the New Living Translation, which I've really appreciated very, very much. If you wanted to do a critique on it, I'm sure there are some translations that Adventists wouldn't like. But overall, I've really enjoyed reading it very, very much. I also had told you that one of my goals was that during my Bible reading, my goal was to come up with 100 new sermon ideas. Well, this is my sabbatical sermon ideas for 2014. It's thick. It's about 135 sermon ideas. So even though I didn't get the Bible reading done in the breadth, I've got some real in-depth Bible reading done. And so I met that goal. Another goal I had was to just kind of get caught up. I worked on my sermon file. I had sermons that weren't filed away and they were just kind of in a stack. And so I did that filing. I also decided I was going to clean up just a little bit. And so I went through 3 of these large boxes full of accumulation. Now, how do they accumulate? Well, I discovered a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago, that the easiest way to clean off your desk is to open your drawer. But there comes a time when the drawer is full. And so then you have to clean out the drawer, and the easiest way to clean out the drawer is in a box. So I had these boxes of accumulation of things that had been needing my attention for 3 or 4 years. And so I went through them all. I forced myself to do one of 3 things. There were only 3 options with what to do in this box. The first was to read it. Second, file it. Or third, trash it. So what I did was I went through all this material. I multitasked. I went through all this material in the mornings when I was riding my stationary bike. I stacked up some boxes right beside my stationary bike. And while I was riding my bike, I went through all this material. So if I wanted to read it, I had time to read it. If I found something that needed a reply back in 2011, I threw it away. And in actual fact, those 3 boxes were reduced to less than 1/3 of a box. It just shows you how things can accumulate. I have to admit, I also discovered that I had promised to do some things for a number of you that never got done because I found some old to-do lists. So if you know that you were on my to-do list and I didn't get done what I told you I'd do, I'm sorry. I threw the to-do list away. Ask again. But it was really quite good to get rid of all this accumulation. I also had a little time to play with some of my toys. Some of my pottery pieces, I spent some time doing a little bit of cataloging and a little bit of organizing and a little bit of sorting. And that's always a fun thing to do. I worked on a number of projects around the house. You can't study 15 or 16 hours a day. And so I also spent a lot of time outside working in the lawn, trimming trees, burning brush. My wife has really appreciated that about me being on sabbatical. Even though she says she's glad I'm back, she enjoyed those things that I got done. While I was on sabbatical, the switch for the dining room light went out. Found out on Sabbath, it was fixed on Sunday. That's a novel idea. It should have been at least a 3-month job. But it was done. She enjoyed that. I had a time for prayer. Had more time for reflection. And I'll talk a little bit in just a little while about some of the reflections that I had. And so as I end my sabbatical, I have to tell you that I feel really good. I feel better than I have for quite a while, and especially I think I've actually totally recovered from the surgery I had back in May. So I'm thankful that I'm feeling so good at this point in time. One other thing that I did while I was on sabbatical was I went back to Indiana Academy for alumni weekend for my 40-year class reunion. I told someone I was going back to Indiana Academy for my 40-year reunion. They said, "No way." I was just scared to ask why they said that. Whether they thought it was less or perhaps more. So I didn't even follow up on it. But just to prove to you that it has been 40 years, I'm probably going to regret showing this picture to you. So that's my senior class picture. It's in black and white because there wasn't color printing invented yet. No, that's not true. It was in black and white because they couldn't afford to have color in our yearbook. So that's why. They did have color printing back then, really. So I went back for my 4-year class reunion. My class was in charge of the Friday night Vespers, and so I was asked to speak to the Vespers on Friday night to those who had come. It's an awesome opportunity, but also a kind of sobering responsibility. I knew there would be people there that night listening that haven't been in church since last alumni weekend. What an opportunity. And so you think, what do I want to share? I thought, I could say something cute, tell some cute stories and let people think I'm funny. I could just try to do something that people would remember for a long time, something to impress them. But I was reminded of something I learned very early in my ministry. Someone told me this. Some old preacher told me this. And I've remembered it many times. He said to me one time, he said, you know, you can't make yourself look good and Jesus look good at the same time. Pretty good wisdom. And so I decided that I really wanted to say something that would point people to Jesus. And as I come back from my sabbatical, I have this text that I want to share with you this morning. It's very important to me. Not only what I wanted to share with my friends at Alumni Weekend, it's something that I want to make sure is the principles with which we run this church. The text is from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Let me just read it to you from the screen. It says, Paul writing here, says, when I first came to you, dear brothers and sisters, I didn't use lofty words and impressive wisdom to tell you God's secret plan. For I decided that while I was with you, I would forget everything except Jesus Christ, the one who was crucified. As people left Alumni Weekend, as people leave this church family from week to week, I want to make sure that people remember Jesus. That's the most important thing. To know Christ. Another translation you're probably more familiar with says, I've decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. The King James says, I determined to know nothing but Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I wanted to make that my theme as I spoke to these people at Alumni Weekend. And I wanted to make that my theme on my first Sabbath back from my sabbatical with you, my church family. That's what I want my theme to be. Now, unfortunately, in my life, especially when I was in the academy, that was not always my theme. If you'd have asked my teachers or the staff member or even the dean, they would have said, yeah, that's Frank's theme. He loves Jesus. He doesn't forget about Jesus. And that's me playing the guitar, week of prayer, Elder Webb, Francis, and me up front, probably leading Side by Side We Stand. I mean, you always had to sing that for week of prayer, right? Back in the 70s. And so I would like to lead out, and I spoke often up front. I was pastor of the boys' club my senior year. You know, we all look the same with those haircuts, right? But that's me right there. Yeah, I was skinny. About 130 pounds probably. So I was involved. But the problem was that my buddies knew me in the dorm. And they knew my theme in the dorm wasn't always Jesus. And so at Alumni Weekend, I'm confronted with the guys I used to live in the dorm with. They knew the Frankie Zolman that lived in the dorm. And so there was another opportunity to share with them what I stand for, what I believe in. Now, as a teenager, I was never far from Jesus. I was relatively close to Jesus. And wouldn't you say being close to Jesus is a good thing? But close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. I don't believe we need to be close to Jesus. You could take an electric cord connected to a light, take it up to a wall plug, and hold it right against the wall plug, 1/16 of an inch away. Do you have any electricity? Do you have any light? No. There's only one way, and that's to be connected. So I don't believe we need to be close to Jesus. I believe we need to be connected to Jesus. Because that's the only time that His power can flow into us. To be connected to Him. But I struggled with that for many years. It's interesting to come back to a thing like Alumni Weekend and remember the class as it was. This was the 50-year class who was presenting the Sabbath morning service. Ronnie Hackelman's right there on the platform. It was her 50 year. And so it's interesting to come back to these gatherings. We come back and we really kind of want to look good, don't we? We don't want to look bad. If somebody says, well, I don't care what they think of me, I'm going to say liar. We do care what they think of us. We do care. We want to dress decently. Don't have to be dressed in a suit and tie or something, but everyone was dressed decently. I had planned, it rained on Friday before Sabbath. I had planned to go wash my car on my way to Alumni Weekend because even though I have a 3-year-old Honda CRV, it's nothing fancy. One doesn't go to Alumni Weekend with a dirty car. But it rained, and so I didn't wash it, so I did go with a dirty car. We get to Alumni Weekend. We look at each other. Who's the most successful? Who's changed the most? Who's changed the least? I've often thought we ought to give an award on Alumni Weekend, although no one would probably admit it. An award for the person that's lost the most weight in preparation for Alumni Weekend. How would you prove that? Before and after pictures. But nobody's going to give you the before picture. But, maybe if we gave a $1,000 prize, that might get a few people to turn loose of it. We go walk around in the ad building and look at all those pictures on the walls. And we look at them and we say, oh, what babies. And then we look at each other and we say, oh, wow, how old you look. Do I look that old? Yeah, you do. When I was preaching, I said when I look at my academy pictures, I realized that when I was in academy, I was a geek. Even though we didn't have that word 40 years ago. I realized I was a geek. To which my ex-friend named Jim, who was sitting in the audience back there in his seat, piped up and said, don't worry, Frank, we knew you were. Well, thanks. I appreciated that, Jim. That's why he's my ex-friend, right? Pull my yearbook out. We look at how we judged each other back then. I think all of our yearbooks have these pages. The most likely to succeed, the most reliable, the most studious, the most witty, the most talented, the best dressed. I've never seen one category who's most likely to be in heaven or not. That would be an interesting one. In my yearbook, my picture's not pictured in any of them. I wasn't the most anything. Except, perhaps I was the most likely to be a fool. Now, is it good to be a fool or bad to be a fool? Well, it all depends on who or what you're a fool for. When I started dating my wife in college, my college roommate, his name is Rick, did not care for her very much. I started pursuing her, taking her out. We spent a lot of time together. My roommate Rick says to me one day, he says, Zolman, you remind me of an old dog chasing a car. Now, what's that dog going to do with a car when he catches it? That's a good question. I caught her 37 years ago. I still don't know what to do with her. She was here for first service. I said that, and she smiled at me. She still loves me. Wives, wouldn't you think it'd be okay if someone called your husband a fool for you? It all depends on what you're a fool for. I mean, who couldn't be a fool for this little boy, right? Just in case you didn't figure it out, that's my grandson. See, that's the nice thing about being a preacher. You get to show pictures of your kids or your grandchildren and nobody can get mad at you. I mean, who wouldn't be a fool for that kid, right? Is it good to be a fool? It all depends who and what you're a fool for. Paul talks about this in the book of 1 Corinthians, which we read our scripture reading from. Turn, please, with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 10. Paul starts the verse out by saying this. First Corinthians chapter 4, verse 10. He says, our dedication to Christ makes us look like fools, but you are wise. Our dedication to Christ makes us look like fools. Are you willing to be a fool for Jesus? No matter what anybody says, are you willing to stand up for him? You know, as a 15, 16, 17-year-old, 18-year-old graduating from Indiana Academy, if there's the last thing I wanted to be called was a fool. I wanted to be cool, not a fool. The last thing I wanted to be was called a fool. But Paul says that if we love Jesus, some people will think we're foolish. Some people will think we're fools. He has been talking about this earlier in 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, he starts off with this idea of being a fool. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, Paul says, I know very well how foolish the message of the cross sounds. But then he finishes. How foolish the message of the cross sounds to those who are on the road to destruction, to those who are not being saved. For people who don't love God, the preaching of the cross seems foolish. And those who believe it seem like fools. He picks up the theme down in verse 22. He says, God's way seems foolish to the Jews because they want a sign from heaven to prove it is true. And it is foolish to the Greeks because they believe only what agrees with their wisdom. So when we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are offended and the Gentiles say it's all nonsense. Paul's talking about the problem of following Jesus, and people think we're fools for it. He says the Jews don't like the preaching of the cross because they think it's foolishness. Later on he says they think it's a stumbling block. Why? Because the Jews believed, because of this Old Testament text, it says, cursed is anyone who hung on a tree. Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. So because Jesus was crucified, the Jews rejected him as a Messiah because he was cursed. What they didn't understand was that was the point of it. He was supposed to be cursed. That was why he was hung on a cross. They missed Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 verses 3 through 5. They knew that. I mean, they knew these texts, but they didn't connect the two. Isaiah 53, it says, he was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with bitterest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way when he went by. He was despised and we did not care. Yet it was our weakness he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God for his own sins. But he was wounded and crushed for our sins. He was beaten that we might have peace. He was whipped and we were healed. That was the point. He was cursed. That's the way God planned it. God didn't mess up by putting that text in the Old Testament and then having Jesus crucified. That was his plan. He was cursed. But the Jews said, no way, how could a Messiah die on a cross? That's only for the worst of criminals. Yeah, that's why it should have been for you. But Jesus died in your place. For the Greeks, it was foolishness, because the Greeks had this belief about their God, their gods, I should say, that taught them that the gods could not have any feelings toward humans. It's called apathy. The Greek word is apatheia. We get the word apathy. The Greek gods were apathetic toward humans. Why? Well, they believed that if for any moment a human being could have a god love him or her, or if a human being could get a god to be angry at him or her, during that moment, the human had more power than God. It's logical, right? So therefore, the gods had to be apathetic toward humans. They couldn't love them, they couldn't hate them. The gods could, and they did quite frequently, lust after human women, but they could not love them, because that would give the human power over the God. And so, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Ridiculous! God couldn't love the world. God couldn't love the world and die on a cross. It's foolishness. And you have to, I think it makes sense. From their point of view, it says it's foolishness to those who are perishing. From their point of view, it makes sense. It is foolishness. But those two verses are a little bit negative. But when you get down to verse 24 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says this. He says it's foolishness, but, verse 24, but to those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the mighty power of God and the wonderful wisdom of God. You know, people from outside in the world say you look foolish to be a Christian, to believe in God, to love Jesus. Do you know what God says? I'm going to take his opinion. God says, Psalm 14 verse 1, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. God says, if you don't believe him, you're a fool. The world says, if you do believe him, you're a fool. I think I'm going to pay attention to God's opinion, don't you think? The power of God. It says, the preaching of the cross it's the mighty power of God and the mighty wisdom of God. The preaching of the gospel of Jesus, the preaching of the fact that Jesus came to this world because he loves us so much. He died in our place. There's power in that message. There's enough power that it can help people who are horrible sinners, murderers, repent. Can help drug addicts become straight. Can help robbers decide to quit robbing. And the power of God is so strong that it can even help Seventh-day Adventists who think they're superior to everybody else. The power of God is not just something for those sinners out there in the world. The power of God is something for the sinners who sit in the pews of our churches every Sabbath. There's power in God, in the Word of God. There's power in the gospel of Jesus Christ, the story of Jesus and his grace and his love for us. Many of you know that because you've experienced that power. Some of you have forgotten it. And I pray that the Lord will reveal it to you again. And this is one of the things I was reminded of on my sabbatical as I looked again at my priorities and I looked at my ministry. As I was on sabbatical, I was reminded again of my call to ministry and of my call to preaching Jesus. and uplifting Jesus. And in conjunction with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, 1 and 2, I have determined again in my own ministry to uplift Christ and his sacrifice and his salvation and his grace before the Williamsport church continually. All the time. And I've also been thinking that any sermon that does not remind us of that may not be a sermon at all. It may just be the speaker's opinions and biases. But if it doesn't uplift Jesus, is it really a sermon? Maybe not. Paul says, I determined to know nothing except for Jesus Christ and him crucified. Does that mean Paul never preached on anything else? Every sermon was simply the gospel story? No. If you read the rest of Paul's writings, he gets into some pretty heavy-duty stuff. But Paul says, I've determined that I would know Christ and him crucified. What I think that means is that Paul was a Jesus fanatic. You know what a fanatic is? A fanatic is someone who, no matter where you start a conversation, you know where they're going to end. A person is a Ravens fan. You know, fan is only shortened for fanatic. A person is a Ravens fan. If you spend much time with that person, you know they're going to talk about the Ravens game this coming Sunday, right? They're going to tell you their record. It's where they always take the conversation. You see, what Paul did is he could talk about many things, but you always knew, no matter where the conversation started, where it was going to end. It's going to end up with Jesus. Now, my wife accuses me of doing this with archaeology. She thinks I'm an archaeology fanatic. You know, someone can be talking about nutrition and the food pyramid. By the way, did you hear that they discovered a new pyramid in Egypt a couple months ago? Yeah. I mean, that's a no-brainer. I mean, you know, easy segue. Someone's talking about gardening. They're beautiful flowers. You know, I've seen pictures of what the hanging gardens of Babylon look like, and they actually think they've discovered the foundation bases of the hanging gardens of Babylon. See, I can do this. Don't doubt me. I'll prove it. How wonderful it would be if Seventh-day Adventists were known as the people who, no matter where you start, they're going to talk about Jesus. Now, I understand that this could be difficult in some places, because if every conversation you ever have with a coworker or a neighbor or a relative who's not spiritually minded, if every conversation ends up with you laying a guilt trip about Jesus on them, they're probably going to, when they see you coming, they're going to go the other direction. So this has to be used expeditiously and judiciously. But what if we became known that every conversation ultimately we talk about Jesus? And that could be simply as simple as telling someone, you know, I had a real blessing this week, and just say something that happened. And I had a real blessing this week. I was driving down the highway and had a flat tire, had a blowout, and could have been really serious, but I think the Lord protected me. See, there are many ways we can bring Jesus into the conversation so that we can become, like Paul, someone who determines to know for all the people around us, Jesus and him crucified. Because of the way I was raised, my mother always told me that I could do anything. It was just me and her against the world for many of my growing up years. And she always told me there's nothing I couldn't do, and I was just dumb enough to believe her. And because of that, I grew up a little boastful and a little bit cocky. So when I graduated from Indiana Academy at the age of 18, I thought I knew every answer. professors, my teachers would have told you that. By the time I finished seminary, 6 years later, I didn't think I knew all the answers. I knew all the answers. I was about 24. By the time I turned 30 and had been pastoring 5 or 6 years, I began to realize that I may not have all the answers, but I was much too stubborn to admit it. I'd just fake it. By the time I turned 40, I had finished my Doctor of Ministry degree, which was a very broadening experience for me. And I began to realize that not only do I not know all the answers, I don't even know all the questions. By the time I turned 50, some of you will relate to this. By the time I turned 50, I started forgetting questions and answers. Something about those years. I'll be turning 60 soon. And after my time of sabbatical and study and prayer, I've realized there really is only one answer that matters. And it's Jesus. And no matter what your need, no matter what your question, He is the answer. I have a question I want to close with this morning. I think you'll know the answer.